Hi, welcome to Give Me the Bible, where God's Word speaks for itself. In wrapping up our discussion of parables, we want to just finish by asking the question, why did Jesus speak in parables? Well, there are really a couple reasons. First of all, it is true that parables, in a sense, helped Jesus explain the mysteries of the kingdom of heaven to people. It helped him relate heavenly spiritual things that if he were to just be very straightforward with his audience about, it would probably be a little esoteric. It would probably be over their heads. They wouldn't really understand what he was talking about. And so parables allowed Jesus to break things down in a way that his audience could relate to and say, the kingdom of heaven is like this, and then tell that familiar story. But there's another sense in which the parables were told by Jesus to hide the mysteries of the kingdom of heaven from people who were not interested in learning about the kingdom of heaven. From the people who had hard hearts and had already made up their minds about Jesus. No matter what Jesus said, they weren't going to listen to him. And you actually see that a lot in the Gospels, don't you? Where Jesus will perform a miracle and it doesn't even really matter. People still aren't satisfied. They want to see more signs. They are continuously doubting Jesus Christ. No matter how many miracles he does, it's not to their satisfaction because they're just not going to believe. They're blind. And the parables actually helped to hide the truth of the kingdom from those people who just aren't interested anyway. It allowed Jesus to speak truth about the kingdom, but the only ones who would actually benefit from those parables are those who are willing to listen to them and to really work to understand what Jesus was saying. And so the parables actually kind of served to separate people. It was like a sword that divided those who were interested in the gospel and those who were not. Because the ones who were interested, his disciples, well, they would stick around and ask Jesus, what do these parables mean? What's going on? But these people over here who weren't interested, they would just hear a parable Jesus told and say, oh, you see, he's crazy. You know, he's talking about seeds and mustard trees and, you know, he's talking about wedding feasts. Again, these random stories. I told you he was crazy. And it just kind of confirms for them their own disbelief in Jesus. And so Jesus actually says this in Matthew 13, so that you make sure I'm not making this up. Matthew chapter 13, the disciples actually ask him in verse 10, Matthew 13 verse 10, why do you speak to them in parables? And Jesus answered them, to you it has been granted to know the mysteries of the kingdom of heaven, but to them it has not been granted. Drop down to verse 13, therefore I speak to them in parables because while seeing they do not see, and while hearing they do not hear, nor do they understand. And in their case, the prophecy of Isaiah is being fulfilled, which says, and he goes on and quotes Isaiah about the people just being dull of hearing and they're not interested at all. And the reason Jesus says the disciples are so blessed is because they see the things that Jesus is saying. Their eyes are open spiritually to the messages that he's trying to teach them through the parables, but the other people, they just aren't. And you can actually see this difference because when Jesus tells the parables to the disciples, they come to him and ask about them. So for instance, in Matthew 13, look in verse 36. It says, he left the crowds and went into the house, and his disciples came to him and said, explain to us the parable of the tares of the field. That was their attitude toward Jesus. Now look at the other attitude in John chapter 10, for instance. Jesus tells a parable explaining that he's a good shepherd. He is the good shepherd, and he's the door that serves as the entrance to the sheepfold, to the kingdom of heaven. And notice, after he gets done with this series of parables, in verse 19, John 10:19, a division occurred again among the Jews because of these words, and many of them were saying, he has a demon and is insane. Why do you listen to him? And others were saying, these are not the sayings of one demon-possessed. A demon cannot open the eyes of the blind, can he? So you see that the parables created this division among people. And it separated the sheep from the goats. It separated those who were interested in hearing and taking the time to learn from Jesus, and those who just really refused to believe no matter what. And that's why Jesus says to the disciples back in Matthew 13, to you it has been granted to know the mysteries of the kingdom. Not because God shows favoritism and selects certain people to be saved and certain people to not be. No, he says to you it's been granted. And in context, it's because they're the ones that are willing to learn from Jesus, and the other people aren't. And the parables serve as kind of that dividing line, that double-edged sword that cuts to righteous people's hearts, and all the other people who aren't interested, it cuts them off from God's kingdom anyway. I hope that that's clear and helpful, and Lord willing, I'll see you next time.